So greetings and thank you for joining us today for the fourth year of the Transitional Justice in the USA Speaker Series in the seventh panel. I'm Lisa LaPlante. I direct the Center for International Law and Policy at New England Law, Boston, where I'm also a professor of law. So as a bit of background, in collaboration with some 40 institutions across the nation, we launched the speaker series in 2021 in order to explore various themes related to the field of transitional justice and how it relates to the current efforts in the United States to redress racial injustice and violence, both currently and historically. So our collective aim is to help raise national attention to this US transitional justice experience, but also offer an innovative lens to explore how these issues that are arising in this national experience relate to experiences globally. And that the US's quest for racial justice through these experiences has synergy with those other experiences, and certainly there's something to be learned from those comparative global experiences, but also that the US experience is offering unique insights into this field of practice. So today's panel is entitled, Do Memory Battles About Contemporary and Historical Racial Injustice in the US Undermine the Right to Truth? So today's speakers will explore how local and state efforts to ban books, to forbid education about racism, including through critical race theory, and to limit the discoverability of online information undermines the right to truth and a full accounting of racial violence, both as a historical fact and of contemporary realities. Panelists will explore how this strategic attack signifies a key battle in either promoting or marginalizing a robust memory in the telling of the American story. The panel will ask how the outcome of this struggle for memory may shape a national narrative that justifies or not reparations and other forms of justice. A comparative look will share how struggles for memory constitute a critical step in advancing a quest for a true reckoning of past wrongs. So before we start, I want to thank the co-organizers of this event, in particular, Louis Bickford, who's a co-founder of Biographica and CEO and founder of Memoria.org, who will also be moderating this panel today, and Priya Morley, who's the director of the International Human Rights Clinic at UCLA School of Law and the Racial Justice Policy Council at the Promise Institute for Human Rights. Thank you both. And finally, I want to acknowledge all the support of our co-sponsors who help assure that this is an inclusive and far-reaching conversation. Before we get started, I want to just offer a bit of background on the logistics. We will be closing down the chat during the panel. You can post questions on the Q&A during the panel, which we will be sharing with the moderator. And then we will enable the chat when the Q&A period does open up. For full biographies of all the panelists, you can visit our website, which you can see listed at the bottom of the screen share presently on the screen. And also, please note that this is a recording that will be posted after the fact, and I believe you all received a consenting to that recording when you entered. So to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce briefly our moderator for today's panel, Louis Bickford, who has worked for 20 so years on collective memory for past episodes of violence, conflict, genocide, and crimes against humanity. And in particular was the director of the Memory Monuments and Museums program at the International Center for Transitional Justice, where he was a founding member and has worked in countries around the world and continues to do so through the social enterprises that he has founded, which I mentioned earlier. So I don't want to hold up the conversation any longer. So I'm going to hand the virtual podium to you, Louis, to get us started. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Lisa, and congratulations on putting together this entire series, which is very, I think, very exciting, and I've been participating in a number of them. Jose Salaquet was one of the founders of the field of transitional justice, Professor Jose Salaquet in Chile, and he famously wrote about the value of truth, not only as evidence for various things, for legal procedures and things like that, but the pure, unadulterated, non-consequentialist, we might say, value of truth, and the truth itself is worth pursuing and understanding. This now has a kind of legal expression in the idea of the right to truth. By the way, Jose Salaquet was the first person to name something called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which of course then had a famous history after 1990 when he launched the first one, which was in Chile. But in any case, truth is also an essential building block of memory. So when we think about collective memory, who we are, how we define who we are, how we remember collectively who we are, truth is a vital piece of that, obviously. And here we're talking about the whole truth. What happened? What happened in terms of violence, in terms of injustice, in terms of heroism, different forms of heroism, heroes and sheroes who may be marginalized from that historical recounting and may not be part of a collective memory by sort of hegemonic memory creation. So today we're going to be talking about that, all of those big topics, the big topics of truth, collective memory, heroes, sheroes, marginalization of voice, but in a way that where the rubber really hits the road. The rubber hits the road here in really concrete ways in the United States right now, and many places around the world. Clara will talk about that when she gets on as well, some of the international experiences, where we're talking about local libraries. I'm a big fan of local libraries, but that's where the rubber hits the road on this. Local libraries, school boards, schools, book banning. This is all a way to restrict the truth and change the way in which we're talking about who we are, and who the we is very complicated, of course, but nonetheless who we are and who we want to be. And the only way we can really do that is if we go back to Salaquet's idea, by remembering the truth about the past. So those restrictions are the kind of way we're going to focus today. And I'm going to shut up right away and turn it over to the spectacular panel that we have. I'm not going to, as Lisa mentioned, I'm not going to introduce people one by one, just simply because their bios are on the website, easy to find, and that gives us more time to focus on the substance. So without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to Taif Alexander. Over to you.
Thanks, Louis. It is an honor to be on this panel to discuss my team's work in investigating the pathways and methods through which anti-CRT measures, including book bans, have spread. I am, as noted in my bio, the CRT Forward Project Director at UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies program, where with the support of those on my team, we have been identifying, tracking, and analyzing local, state, and federal anti-CRT activity, or more specifically, activity that attempts to restrict access to truthful information about critical race theory, about race, and about systemic racism. So through the CRT Forward Tracking Project, we have learned many, many, many things about government entities' efforts to undermine a full accounting of racial violence as a historical fact and as a contemporary reality. So in my designated time, I will share 5 trends we have learned from our CRT Forward data collection and dissemination process. So the first trend is particularly overwhelming and demonstrates the proliferation of anti-CRT measures across the United States. So since September 2021, based on our research, at least 750 different anti-CRT measures have been introduced across all levels of government, from Alaska to New Hampshire and nearly everywhere in between, including California, New York, and other traditionally progressive states. In fact, California local school board officials have introduced a total of 13 anti-CRT measures and have enacted 9 across 8 different school boards, impacting over 136,000 students in district-specific schools. So to be clear, to date, California has more introduced anti-CRT measures at the local school board level than any other state at the same level of local school board. So this leads me to the related second trend. Essentially, our research demonstrates, contrary to the overarching media narrative, that the assault on truth is not limited to traditionally conservative states like Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia, and others. This is happening in every state. Well, except Delaware, which is interesting. So maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A. The third trend that we have noticed is that school-age children are targeted in an overwhelming majority of introduced and enacted anti-CRT measures. CRT forward data demonstrates that 90% of all measures in our database and 94% of all enacted measures in our database target K through 12 education. And oftentimes people ask me, well, why are government officials targeting this specific demographic of school-age children? And my response is, well, if you can control what students can and cannot learn now, you can more easily control the future. So to put it more simply, if you are able to control or restrict children from access to learning about and receiving the tools and resources necessary to address the most pressing social and racial justice issues of our time, then we won't be able to nurture and bring to fruition the change makers and leaders we need to resolve the issues that ail us as a society. The fourth trend we've learned is that the anti-CRT measures have evolved and expanded since the first recorded anti-CRT measure in September 2020, which is the now rescinded Trump administration Executive Order 13950. So specifically, for every one rejected anti-CRT measure in our database, between 3 and 4 have been enacted in its place. So this puts a whole new spin on the adage that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth has an opportunity to catch up. Finally, from our data, we've learned that in each year following 2020, the number of anti-CRT measures, including book bans, have outpaced the year before. So in 2020, we were able to identify, track, and substantively analyze 3 anti-CRT measures. That number grew exponentially to 111 in 2021, 550 in 2022, and 750 to date. So at this point, you may be saying to yourself, wow, 750 different anti-CRT measures across almost every state targeting children in K through 12 schools with an enactment rate of 3 and 4. And the next question might be, well, how did we get here? And that's a very good question. And here's one possible answer. After the public killing of George Floyd, different businesses, government agencies, teachers, administrators, and individuals committed to justice began implementing practices and procedures to guard against future atrocities by incorporating anti-racism into trainings, into classroom instruction, to curriculum, and essentially laying the groundwork to dismantle systemic racism and ultimately move us closer as a nation towards our unfulfilled dream of becoming a multiracial democracy. So it is no coincidence that anti-CRT activity, including book bans at the local, state, and federal levels, immediately followed the unrealized promise of the uprisings during the summer of 2020. And so the dismantling of systemic racism requires access to truth and a full accounting of racial violence, as I mentioned before, as both historical fact and contemporary reality. And that is which is in direct conflict with the current power structure that allows for the banning of books and the proliferation of other anti-CRT activity. So this purposeful, orchestrated, and well-funded campaign against truth is part and parcel of a larger project to erode civil and human rights much broadly. And while it seems daunting to take on this book ban and anti-CRT campaign, you are not in this work alone. CRT Forward is a resource on our site, which you can access by Googling CRT Forward UCLA. You'll find information about the project, including our goals, commitments, and among other things, an interactive map to learn more about the anti-CRT measures, not only in your city and state, but all across the United States. So this is the same data that has been used by parents to challenge pending book bans at their local school board meetings, the same data that has allowed for all 4 California ACLUs alongside other equity organizations to demand the state superintendent of education issue guidance to end the proliferation of these book bans and anti-CRT measures. The same data that teachers and students use to better understand their rights and how those rights are being infringed upon. And so in understanding that this work is not done alone, I am most grateful for my esteemed panelists, the work that they're doing to support truth in education. And with that, I'll yield the rest of the time and look forward the rest of this conversation.
Thank you so much for getting us started on the level of truth, data, information that, research that is concrete, empirically derived from your program. And thanks also for telling people about the resources available through CRT Forward at UCLA and other things. Terrific. Great. Well, let's move on to Carlos Hill at the University of Oklahoma, and then we'll, at some point, all come back for a big discussion. So if you have questions that are beginning to emerge, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the place to put them is in the Q&A for now, and then we'll open the chat again later. But Q&A is probably the best place if things are beginning to percolate. Feel free. Carlos, over to you. Your video is off, by the way, at least as far as I can tell. Nope, on. Perfect.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Carlos. The video popped off again.
Oh, it keeps popping off.
There we go. Now we have both video and
okay.
Okay.
Okay. I see what's the problem. Okay. I see what's the problem. No worries. Thank you so much for that introduction. What I really want to do is to sort of provide some local context for some of the national data that's just been provided. I am a professor at the University of Oklahoma. I teach Black Studies in the Clara Luper Department, African American Studies at the university. And my area of I was going to say interest, but I should really say passion, is really studying, but also just bearing witness to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And my work as a historian took me to working directly with descendants and some survivors of the 1921 Race Massacre. And so I got really proximate to some of the local, but also statewide memory battles around the Race Massacre. And I saw at a really critical juncture, I would say a high point even, a moment in the state where we sort of rallied around the history of this massacre to try to tell the story of what happened during the centennial. But then shortly thereafter, the centennial of the Race Massacre, I saw witness a backlash to that very memory of the massacre. And what I mean by that is in May of 2021, HB 1775 was discussed, but ultimately went into practice in July of 2021. So just a month following the commemoration of the Race Massacre, HB 1775, a law to curb CRT, as well as to curb the teaching of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education in the state of Oklahoma. All that was wrapped into HB 1775. And as was mentioned, these came on the heels right, of not just the Tulsa, sort of remembering the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, but also these really divisive conversations that followed in the wake of George Floyd's murder. All that painted how we have responded in terms of book bans, et cetera. And so I've witnessed this backlash happening in the state of Oklahoma, and I've felt the chilling effect that it has had on not just banning books or banning attempting to ban CRT, diversity, equity, inclusion training, but just in a willingness to talk about and speak out about these histories. In the state of Oklahoma in particular, what has been truly a challenge has been the ways in which actual leaders, like government officials who have been elected by the people, who are participating actively in the creation of hysteria around CRT, as well as just creating real barriers for, through creating fear, barriers for teachers to actually teach, right, the history of the race massacre or anything, right, anything related to marginalized communities in a way that's honest and authentic. And so in the state of Oklahoma, Ryan Walters, who is our current secretary, or excuse me, who's the current superintendent of education, was quoted this past summer as saying that the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre wasn't truly about race. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre was not about race. And he said this at a public meeting in Oklahoma. And, you know, he received tremendous ridicule immediately on social media and otherwise for this really ridiculous statement. But that is the tone of our educational leaders, and the most, one could argue, the most important in the state of Oklahoma, certainly for secondary education, saying that, you know, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre had nothing to do with race at all. And the ways in which just 6 or 7 years earlier, I had witnessed not only grassroots efforts to sort of transform the community's thinking about what occurred, but it just, in so many ways, was just sought to almost invalidate, right, the memories of survivors, right, the last 3 remaining survivors, invalidating their memories by saying that it wasn't about race. And so his comments really drew a deep reaction and forced him for once, right, to sort of retract what he said. But that is, again, the tone and the tenor of sort of you know, educational leadership in Oklahoma to to book bans and to CRT. And so really challenging. And what I want to really sort of focus on in just the few moments that I have is a point that has been made already, which is the true impact that the, you know, using you know, their position to sort of delegitimize histories that marginalized communities have fought hard to try to uplift. The real casualty in this are the students, right? Because we are not giving them the ability to understand, right? Why are individuals in their community protesting racial violence and abuse, right? Why is this occurring, right? If you don't have the historical context to make sense of it, it does appear as if people are simply angry. It does appear as if you know, that they're angry because they don't have context to understand the historical grievance. And so by removing the ability to understand historic racial violence, it cripples us to understand the instances of contemporary violence today. And when we have conversations about justice, right, it becomes almost impossible because we're already alienated against that history. And so that's the true casualty in us not being willing, right, to talk about these histories. That's the true casualty in us limiting the ability for these conversations to happen in classrooms by book bans and so forth. And so I would just stress that is in the state of Oklahoma, we haven't, and I think the UCLA tracking project can sort of help me here. I haven't experienced or heard as much about book bans as there have been just a real curbing around diversity, equity training, a real sort of curbing of anything around transgender sort of training or education. Those are the ways in which Oklahoma, we've seen it. I've seen it most stifled, but I would love to get in more depth about book bans that have occurred and anti-CRT policies at the school board level that have occurred in the state of Oklahoma. But with that, I will stop and yield my time. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. That was extremely important contributions to this conversation, especially for me, the part about decontextualized violence, ahistorical understandings, like why is everybody so angry? And if you don't understand a reason, the history there, the factual history, then it seems completely decontextualized. Let's turn it over to Nadine Farid Johnson from Penn, and then come back. Nadine.
Great. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm really grateful to be here with all of these fellow panelists. So I'll talk a little bit about PEN America, our work on book bans, and how we are working to fight back. PEN America is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the US and around the globe. I serve as managing director for Washington and free expression programs, and I have supported our education team in its work looking not only at book bans, but at educational censorship writ large. As an organization committed to defending free expression and open access to literature for the past 100 years, we really felt compelled to drill down on this problem that we see nationwide and identify the larger trends, including which states are leading the charge to censor books, which topics, voices, identities are being erased or silenced, and just how widespread censorship has become in America, and with it, the diminishment of truth. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation today because I think all of our work together can serve to paint this large picture about what is actually happening here in the US. Over the past 2 years, we've collected reports of rapidly increasing restrictions on books and the freedom to read and learn in classrooms. Based on our data, it is apparent that the US is in the midst of the broadest attack on First Amendment rights in schools that we've seen in generations, with book bans comprising an outsized part of this encroachment on students' freedom to learn. In the 2022-23 school year, from July 1st of last year to June 30th of this year, 3,362 books were banned in school districts across America. These bans affected over 1,500 unique titles by 1,200 authors. 268 illustrators and 14 translators' works were also affected. These books bans marked an increase over the last school year of 33%. And they cover 153 school districts across the country in 33 different states. Over 40% of these bans did occur in school districts in Florida, with Texas, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Utah rounding out the top 5. And Carlos, after this, I will pull Oklahoma stats for you. 75% of the books that we saw banned are young adult in that genre, looking at middle grade books, chapter books, picture books as well. In other words, what we're looking at are books specifically targeted and written for younger audiences. But what we know is that these bans are at base an attempt to use state power to deny the freedom to read masterworks by some of our nation's greatest writers, to deny them the opportunity to learn our history in its full complexity, to see themselves, their families, their communities represented in their curricula and in their libraries, and just to learn the basic skills of understanding differences and exercising empathy. And apropos to what we're talking about today, it is critical that we recognize that the movement behind these bans and behind the related legislation has brought really what has become a single-minded focus to bear on suppressing content and narratives by and about people of color, including LGBTQ plus people of color. And as a result, we believe these bills will have tangible consequences, both for American education and for our democracy, undermining the hallmarks of a liberal education that are supposed to set the US system apart. When we examine the scope of the last 2 years, the books that include diverse characters, primarily characters of color, including LGBTQ plus characters of color, were overwhelmingly subject to book bans. Now, over the past few years, I mentioned now that the most recent school year, but over the past 2 years, from 2021 through to last June, we saw 5,894 instances of books being banned, and 37% of those included characters of color or discussed race and racism. So over 2,000 books. Recent efforts to diversify books for children and teens has led to greater visibility in libraries and classrooms, but the ongoing efforts to push back to ban books with historically marginalized identities, that actually, of course, reduces the progress. And we are seeing now these books that include characters with diverse racial, sexual, and gender identities are being pulled from school and library shelves. I want to offer here a little bit of global context as well, because given our work all over the world to fight threats to free speech, we at PEN America are particularly attuned to the danger in the trends of the past few years. Educational censorship laws and book bans, particularly those that aimed at silencing certain peoples, religions, or viewpoints, are a longstanding tactic, as we know, of oppressive regimes. Apartheid South Africa banned 12,000 books, and of course we know that the Nazi Party burned un-German ones. More recently, in 2018, Iran banned the study of English in primary school to ward off, quote, cultural invasion. As of 2019, the Turkish government had removed and destroyed more than 300,000 books from Turkish schools and libraries since the attempted coup of 2016. Hungary banned all curriculum referencing homosexuality from schools, and Russian laws banned so-called LGBT propaganda and punished criticisms of the state. Now, the US has long been a global standard bearer for free speech, but as we whittle away at the rights of our own people, so too do we imperil the freedoms for others. And unfortunately, we are also seeing now more recent censorious efforts here echoed elsewhere. In a recent report, a third of librarians in the UK, from the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, called CILIP, they have reported requests from members of the public to censor or remove books that touch upon the British Empire, that touch upon race, or LGBTQ plus issues. Australia, Canada, Sweden, all of these have seen an uptick in bans, threats against librarians, or similar acts of chilling speech. So what we are witnessing here is a concerted campaign to try to halt and roll back the implications of our evolving and pluralistic society. And these measures violate bedrock constitutional principles that undergird our public education system: a commitment to the free exchange of ideas, open access to knowledge, and robust academic inquiry. So what are we doing in response? Well, we have worked in an advisory capacity with students, educators, and community leaders in several school districts, municipalities, and counties across the country: Urbandale, Iowa, Miami-Dade, and Pinellas counties in Florida, et cetera, many across the country, to call attention to book removals, to express reproach, and to press for reversals. We have a reporting mechanism on our website we invite you to visit, where students who have encountered banned or restricted books can report book bans in their community for our monitoring. And we've activated our membership, which you're also invited to join, comprised of novelists, journalists, nonfiction writers, editors, others, and allies, as well as devoted readers and citizen supporters, to take action on several fronts, including urging Congress to combat particular bills, and talking with school districts to encourage them to replace books, to put books back on the shelves. And we have also now, we are pursuing litigation, and we have brought suit in Escambia County, Florida. We are joined in that suit by several incredibly courageous parents on behalf of themselves and their minor children, by Penguin Random House, the country's largest publishers, and by 5 authors whose books have been banned. Ultimately, the strength of this rebuttal of this censorship that we are seeing is within the diverse coalitions and different experts working across the country together, and we look forward to continuing that work. I'll yield back my time. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Nadine. PEN is such an impressive organization, obviously doing amazing work. Clara, are you there? There you are. Good to see you. Over to you. You're on mute. Still on mute.
Thank you, Louis. It's been a hectic day today here. So, well, I just wanted to bring into this conversation a little bit more of an international comparative background from my experience working within the field of transitional justice and education, and more currently with a focus on genocide and mass atrocity prevention, and how education can contribute to prevent these types of crimes. No. And well, first of all, I'm really honored to be part of this panel. I think it's a very important topic that, as Nadine was saying, unfortunately, we are seeing these kind of episodes around the world in a moment in history in which we thought these things were overcome. And actually, many societies transitioning from difficult pasts have been trying to take these difficult topics to the classroom. And that was kind of more or less the struggle that we were seeing. But now it seems that consolidated democracies, or what we thought were consolidated democracies, are actually trying to in a way deny citizens, or like make it difficult for citizens to be informed about their societies, and then to be able to act accordingly. No. So, as well, you very well know, Louis, transitional justice is a field that emerged in the end of last century, and definitely developed after the 2000s with several major achievements. And basically, it's how to deal with the legacies of the past in many different manners, through justice for perpetrators, justice for victims, and of course, the establishment of the rights to truth and memory. From the early days in Latin America and East Europe to Africa, Asia, and the expansion of the transitional justice movement, also to work or to be looked into from that perspective into some historical injustices, which is what we are dealing with now more specifically. Education has been a field that has been playing a lot with transitional justice. So, like every truth commission, I think, that exists from the very beginning, always makes recommendations regarding the curricula, the changes in the curricula, changes in the educational system, and even in some cases, like in South Africa, I think it was Nadine or Taifa talking about this, know how the apartheid system actually used education as a means to promote the regime. It is not a coincidence that one of the most important laws of the apartheid regime was the Bantu education laws, which not only made two different ways of education, so there was like access to higher level education for the white population, whereas the Black population were just would have technical education, if any, and or like whatever would be able to do. But of course, books and narratives were portraying a narrative of the history of the country in which reflected the common perspectives of the system. No. So there's been a lot said about how education can contribute to mass atrocity. I mean, there's many other examples. Rwanda would be, for example, another good example. I mean, there's plenty of them. Hitler, the Nazi Germany. I think Nadine was also talking about how clear the Nazi regime, as most authoritarian regimes, had about how to control education. And then it's been slowly that transitional justice has understood that as part of this right to truth and this right to memory, it's not just only about stating what happened and what are the facts, which was the task of the first truth commissions, but actually to take this into the public sphere and make changes that happen in a level that it's not just the institutional or kind of like the more factual, or even what is the name they used, kind of like, yeah, not the narratives, but the facts of what happened. So as I was saying, many truth commissions and then many countries have acted upon. The more time passes, the more we're seeing this as a case, from the first attempts in Sierra Leone to do a child-friendly version of the Truth Commission report, to a secondary book, a secondary school book. Canada, the TRC in Canada also did a lot of work in this respect. Now Colombia is doing amazing work. Both the Centro Nacional para la Memoria Histórica and the Truth Commission have been very much aware of this dimension of like including this educative dimension in the transitional justice process. So as did Peru. The Truth Commission report in Peru has just a chapter about education. But just kind of saying this, because so to say that this has always been an obvious connection, but it's not always been acted upon. And to the contrary, most countries that go through a process of transition, or from authoritarianism to democracy, or from peace, from conflict to peace and democracy, it's very normal that for a certain amount of years, or in the beginning, the difficult past, it's removed from history books and from the classrooms and from these spaces. And I mean, in a way, let's not fool ourselves. It's not a good thing, but it's understandable because the conflict is very recent and it's not such an easy topic to deal with. But as time goes by, it's obvious that this is a demand that societies have, and it's just not something that can be given for granted. No, I always say that there's this idea, no, like, I mean, whether we talk about sequencing the different mechanisms, and like whether we have truth and justice and reparations, and like normally one would think, well, education come the last, and then, you know, there's going to be reforms in the education system, which at the end of the day, it's influencing the public sphere of a country so that people can have engaged conversations about the past. And you could see this as a kind of like a process that has different stages. But for me, in a way, it's completely kind of the contrary. It's to think that for me, when a society, a government finally decides to make a statement, a bold statement, which goes together with acts of making changes to include these topics in the curricula, for me, that's one of the strongest signs of the commitment of the government with grappling with that difficult past. This is something we've seen in Argentina, for example. I mean, Argentina is one of the countries that did many and most of the efforts that we've seen in the world to promote transitional justice. And eventually they created a unit within the Ministry of Education that was called the Educación y Memoria, which had materials, trained teachers. I mean, it really took seriously that statement. So as did Germany. I mean, it's a different context, of course, post-World War II. There was also the denazification process. Also, it was very complicated, but Germany has taken a stand of making Holocaust education something that it's fundamental in its curricula, which is not the case in most European countries. And I'm from Spain. I would say I don't think that kids today still, it was not my case, but I don't think kids today study the Civil War in the way it should be studied in the Spanish classrooms, for example. So this is what I mean to say that it's for me, it's a sign of maturity, of democratic maturity, and a strength of like the commitment that government has with citizens. And this is for several reasons. I mean, it's a fallacy to think that memory is not going to pass on. Just to think that if we erase this, it's just going to disappear. That doesn't happen. It just happens in other places through other means, and most likely with a lot of problems. Because precisely the classroom, when you have a system in which you work with pedagogies, with different narrative proposals. I mean, we know a lot about these topics nowadays. Of course, it's not easy, but it can be done. Multi-perspective approaches, looking into different texts, and like there's ways in which this can be studied in a safe manner. Definitely much more so than leaving this to the private transmission, intergenerational transmission of memory, which is just gonna create a lot of noise, misconceptions, and kind of keep moving forward taboos one way or the other. The classroom, when it's ready for it, it's probably the most safest space to deal with these topics in a serious manner, which is at the end of the day also something that the state owes its citizens, in the sense that it's not about these legacies only. It's also about the right that young people and all of us have to be informed about our history and where we come from in order to be able to act upon and decide what kind of citizenship we want to build. And if we don't have that information, it's impossible that we act upon those consequences. And I think that in the United States today, this is a very relevant issue and a very relevant question. And that also brings me to another point, which I think it's fundamental, and it's in the end of the day, the recognition to victims, which is one of the main goals of all transitional justice measures. At the end of the day, it's to give space to those stories, to the narratives of what people endured, in order for us to be able, as citizens today, to act upon that knowledge. And that's linked with our idea of being an engaged citizenship. So definitely books are not dangerous. The space for debate is the space where we can confront different narratives, we can learn from them in a contextualized manner with a human rights or civil rights framework, which is what classrooms should look like. And we know by history that the more the classroom secludes these types of narratives, the more likely is that there's not going to be space for a plural public sphere in which citizens can take ownership of their own history, the history of their countries, and consequently act upon them and be engaged citizens today. I'm not saying about undoing the past. That cannot be undone, unfortunately, in many cases, but we can change the way the future looks forward, informed on what we learned from that past. And the classroom is definitely a place in which that should be happening more often.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Clara. So let's I invite everyone to sort of come back. I think that it's just one person at a time is being shown to the viewing audience, but still we can sort of all be on screen. And I really invite people. I see some familiar names and a lot of unfamiliar names, but some familiar names on the list. So I know some of you probably have great questions. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. But in the meantime, I have about 300, so I can easily carry us through for a little while. I mean, I have so many. This is just such a great panel, and I'm so excited to be with all of you. So maybe just to start us off on a very high conceptual kind of level, I wonder if I could pick up a conversation that we started actually when we met very briefly before this, which was around the idea of memory as resistance. And I invite anyone here to kind of reflect on this. I mean, first of all, let us agree, I think we all agree, that the things we're talking about here are not sort of gentle conversations. Sometimes they're gentle conversations, but sometimes these are fraught battles, right? This is the contestation of memory is something that carries with it huge amount of interests, economic interests, some cases, hegemonic racial interests, other kinds of interests. I mean, there are massive things happening here. And the idea of memory as resistance in a kind of effort to reclaim marginalized stories or assert identity on the memoryscape, what I sometimes call the memoryscape, which the term memoryscape, I don't know if it's used by anyone other than me, but when I use it, I use it to mean all of this. So we're talking about books. We're also talking about, monuments, memorials, all the stuff that we kind of bump into every day, whether we're school children in a school or going into a library as a kind of civic institution. So I wonder if I could just bounce it back to you to talk about this kind of contestation of power. What is happening here, and just this already came up a number of times in the conversation, but I'd love to sort of flesh that out. I don't know if anybody wants to respond. Carlos, it looks like you're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that prompt, a provocative prompt. I love saying remembrance is resistance, particularly in this moment right now where we're facing these really ahistorical, these attempts to ahistoricize moments in history that make us confronted, right? And like in terms of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, its 100th anniversary, having to talk about what it really was really difficult because there were so many descendants and a few remaining survivors that wanted to tell an authentic story of what happened. It was a massacre. And with the sheer weight of their memory, that pushed not only the state, but also the Tulsa Race, what was initially the Tulsa Race Riot Centennial Commission, to transform it to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So that came from a memory struggle that revolved around descendants and survivors trying to tell a more authentic story of what happened in and around the centennial of the anniversary. And so when I think of remembrance as resistance, that's what I'm thinking about, like the ways in which marginalized communities and or victim, survivor, descendant communities, the ways in which their memory gets centered, particularly in these moments to try to ahistoricize what actually happened, where you have Superintendent Ryan Walters saying the Tulsa Race Massacre, that wasn't really about race. And oh, by the way, slavery wasn't that bad. He had just a really amazing public meeting this past summer where he really tried to delegitimize these histories, right? And so in the face of those efforts, remembrance is resistance.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, go ahead, Clara. I was going to jump in.
I would say something that it can also resonate in every society in different moments. Normally, history until very recently was written by the winners of history, you know. So kind of, if that's the expression I want to use. So definitely, when we talk about remembrance, which normally comes with vindicating narratives that have been silenced by those who wrote history, it's about resisting, because it's about seeing history in a different manner than what has been established as the status quo. And that's not an easy task, but it's one that it's very important, and I would even say mandatory to be done.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's of the Confederate monuments discussion, which sometimes is phrased as erasure of history, or sometimes put into similar terms, as we may be saying that book banning is a kind of erasure. But it's obviously, to me anyway, so categorically different in the sense that that is, and by the way, that's an example of the losers writing history in the South, which is the exception to the rule, right? That was the consolation prize for losing, was they got to write the narrative in the South. But anyway, that battle is a perfect example of a kind of battle in which a history that is distorted is being asserted. And that is a kind of hegemonic history. And the response to that is a kind of resistance to reassert a more inclusive, broader history. Anyway, I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on this question. Yeah, Nadine, yeah.
I would just say briefly, it's a great question. I'm glad you raised it. One of the things that struck me when I was working on this initially, when we began this, was the efforts to ban biographies, particularly of women of color. Michelle Obama, Ruby Bridges, Malala Yousafzai, Sonia Sotomayor, these were the names that were taken off of the shelves. And I think it was Timothy Snyder who said something along the lines of, if you eliminate, if you censor the truth, censor books, censor memory, you are eliminating the power, eliminating influence. And that's what we're seeing here, right? This effort to, if you take them away, we can't discuss, we can't learn, we can't talk, we can't envision what and how we want to build a different type of society.
I am actually working a lot in biography these days. I'm thinking of a lot about the genre of biography, and there are only 2 million biographies in the English Wikipedia. It's very hard to get a biography published in English in Wikipedia. And only 17% of those biographies are women. And even fewer are people from sort of historically marginalized communities, et cetera. It's not exactly Wikipedia's fault. They're aware of this. But the fact that the accessibility of biography is limited either, sometimes informally through these informal relationships of hegemonic power and white supremacy and things like that, sometimes in the ways that you're talking about, which are much more formally through law and regulation, et cetera. But I loved what you said. You said it inhibits our ability to envision. I would also say inhibits our envision to imagine a future, to imagine ourselves. I mean, this is what, people say about seeing positions in people in positions of power that quote unquote look like them as being, that I can imagine that future, and take that writ large for a society. Okay, how are we doing? Other comments on this? Okay, well, I have another. How are we doing on the Q&A here? Oh, come on, you guys! I know you got some very smart, loquacious people on this thing. So toss in a question here. But in the meantime, let me ask a very practical question. So in the United States, this is such a decentralized set of problems, right? I mean, is there a role for the federal state in this, for the national state in this? And what would that look like exactly? And I'm sure the Biden administration is thinking about these kinds of questions. But at the same time, and this came across so clearly in the presentations, this is decentralized down to the level of a single library or a single school system or something, which, and Nadine, you started to throw out some of the kind of concrete solutions, but I guess, and a couple of you did, but I guess my question is how do you deal with such a decentralized problem? I don't know. I mean, some of the thoughts have already been advanced, but I know that you probably have more thoughts on that set of questions. Anybody? Taifa, but yeah, go ahead.
So to answer your question, yes, there is a lot that can be done, even though this seems very decentralized. But before I get to that, I want to provide a little bit of context in saying that what we have noticed is that in addition to the anti-CRT campaign, there's also this silence amongst progressive lawmakers and elected officials on this topic. And as Dr. King once said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And this silence speaks volumes. But to be fair, that is in large part a result of the effectiveness of this campaign, which has co-opted, constricted, and misdefined terms like critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that people even before this didn't really know what critical race theory was. And so it's a further muddying of the waters that has allowed for folks not to speak up and not to want to touch something that seems very polarized, right? And so one of the things that we are trying to do in order to break this cycle of back and forth censorship versus truth by breaking free from the silencing campaign as well is that when I was the assistant dean for diversity at a small private liberal arts institution in South Carolina, I used to provide my students with scripts. And it helped them to practice, to know what to say when they were sitting around a Thanksgiving dinner table with an aunt or an uncle who were diametrically opposed to them politically. And so instead of scripts with talking points that students can memorize, my next endeavor is a how-to, quite literally, on how to draft, introduce, and enact model measures that defines what critical race theory, while also encouraging school districts and local libraries and private institutions and all of these other organizations to support and protect rather than punish teachers, administrators, employees, and contractors. And so there's a way to do this at the legislative level, at the local school board level, at an individual private business level, at colleges and universities. And there's certainly a way to do that at the federal level, right? So the Secretary of Education provides guidance all the time. And so in my mind, you know, New York doing one thing and, you know, Texas doing another is sufficient enough to say, you know, we need to be able to speak to this thing. And I think a model guidance letter from the Department of Education would be extremely helpful in this particular instance. And there's, people may disagree because what is guidance, right? It doesn't have the same legal strength as a law might or an executive order might. But what I have noticed is that because this thing is happening on all different levels, you need an individual level response in accordance with what's going on. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, but thanks. Clara?
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce what Taifa was saying, because I mean, centralization in education or decentralization both have good things and bad things. Like, imagine the previous administration completely centralizing the education system of the country, how hard that could have been in respect of a topic such as this. But I think it's important to see the educational system from all the instances, from the federal to the state level, and then schools and even teachers, and then adopt that supportive approach that that Taifa was talking about. And there, I think the federal government has so much to do, not only creating some kind of guidance or like white paper, call it however you want it to be called, written by many hands, that just provides some ideas for people that, again, are dealing with very difficult topics, that deal with a lot of controversy, and that they are scared, they want to, but they don't know how to. And this will allow them to feel not legitimized, because they are, but like give them the support to be able to say, what I'm doing, it's, you know, there's a backing for me, even if I don't have it from my direct policy level, but I do have this. And there's many things that can be done, like support for organizations doing this amazing work. There's like production of materials, creation of videos, things that actually challenge from the reasonable perspective what we're talking about. We're not talking here about promoting certain vision of history. We're promoting a democratic history that recognizes all these different things. And now we're actually trying to silence one specific part. So I think there's many different areas and actions that the federal government can do in order to support this work in different levels, and that at the end of the day, it arrives to the teachers, who are the ones that at the end, they make the difference in the classroom. And I think that even they don't have like that direct authority on the state level, they can definitely support a lot of actions and move forward.
Yeah, and your answer is partially about federal government, but also partially about national organizations and national movements and things that are sort of at that level that are developing guidelines and other kinds of things. Nadine?
Yes, I just wanted to second what my colleagues here have said. I think the silence is a really important point that Taifa is making. And I would say that there are two things that can be done on the federal level, in addition to what's been shared here. One is accountability. We do have a Department of Education, as much as it has been, rough handled over various administrations, but it is there. It has an Office of Civil Rights, and there can be accountability measures that are carried out there. And then it's also messaging. There was during Banned Books Week, which I'm so sad we have to commemorate Banned Books Week, but there you go. We had a bicameral resolution that was led on the Senate side by Brian Schatz from Hawaii, and on the congressional side by Jamie Raskin from Maryland. And it's a resolution. It's not going to create a lot of affirmative acts to be undertaken, if you will, but it does reaffirm the rights that are at stake. It does reaffirm the right to read. It recognizes the prevailing Supreme Court jurisprudence. And I think those measures are important as well. So that's the thing I would just point out.
Thank you. Great. Actually, before we're going to, I wanted to see if there's anybody here, and I'll just plant this in the group, the audience, in other words, who is themselves a teacher or directly involved in the kind of coalface struggles that we're talking about here. I mean, one of the things that I've heard a lot about is that from organizations like Facing History and yourself, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, somebody on this call is connected to that organization. But anyway, it's a great organization where they say, oh yeah, Carlos, yeah, where they say, you know, it's not really about the curriculum, it's really about the teachers. It's about the teacher training and incorporating teachers and empowering teachers and things like that. Curriculum is important, but that's just a partial measure. And anyway, so if there are any people who are librarians, teachers, you know, directly confronting these, we'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, Lisa, you had a comment or a thought.
Yeah, thank you, Louis. And I've been sitting here listening to all of you and really, really appreciate all of your contributions. And you know, for me, just looking globally at the struggle for memory, which occurs in all of these settings, and one of the key issues for me is recognizing that it's usually quite strategic in order to undermine other efforts to achieve justice. And so one of the things that's going on currently in the US is more movement than ever before towards not just federal truth commission reparation initiatives, but also localized, decentralized. And so when you're looking at this point, seems a pretty national orchestrated campaign to undermine not only what is history, but also to stigmatize and even put in fear those who may talk about it, including apparently white people who are too woke. That there's a reason for that, right? People start to fight most when they're threatened. And so I'm curious if anyone has any perspective on, you know, how this could be understood as trying to prevent the type of change that these initiatives would bring on. And then secondly, one of the impacts of this type of memory battle is how it affects those whose truths are being dismissed or undermined or even criminalized. And what is the impact and how does that even set us backwards? And those are two separate questions that maybe some of the panelists could speak to.
Anybody want to take that up? The second one I'm thinking of is kind of the psychological or even bigger than psychological kind of effects of being denied voice or being further marginalized by historical kind of narratives, exclusion of books, etc. Other thoughts? I mean, it's also it's kind of standalone comment in a way, Lisa, right? I mean, in other words, it is a fact that these are devastatingly difficult.
I think that's really the problem. Like at the end of the day, there is this narratives, this knowledge that it's linked to how people would behave accordingly, and of course, because that like there's a resistance towards that changes, or like people claiming for those changes or these things to happen, that it's easier or it's like it's a key target. I mean, for me, it's very clear. Like I keep, you know, I've been doing now education for many years, and like originally my work was only focused in transitional justice contexts, but now we work in the Outreach Institute. We work in different spaces, and you know, like we say that freedom of expression or like a free press is fundamental for a democracy. You know, it's like the fourth pillar, or like the fourth power. Well, you would say the same thing for the arts, for the public sphere, for education. And yet democracies really struggle to promote democratic curricula, like giving children and young people the skills to deal with this. I mean, it's for very good reasons. One can be extremely what's the word in English? Cynical about this, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of cynicism in this, but of course it's difficult, it's complicated. It's like there's going to be 20,000 versions of how democratic education should look like, and just not to take on that fight, we just don't do nothing, which at the end of the day it's worse. But on the contrary, it's completely the opposite. It's what we were saying, like all the authoritarian regimes that I've known of, or like, I mean, even war situations, have taken on education as one of the most important tools from the very beginning. It's a very clear agenda. And why? It's because you want to control what people think, so they will behave as you want them to behave, because that's the only way we can, in theory, influence on humans' behavior. No? I mean, of course. So I think democracies need to learn to do this better, even if it's taking the fight of having a discussion of what it's exactly what we're talking about. Because at the end of the day, I don't think it's a coincidence. We are seeing a lot of backsliding in our democratic systems that I think it has to do with not only, of course, but that many of the things that we've seen in the education sphere recently, in terms also of, how the curricula is being more technical and more market oriented and several other things. It's definitely affecting capacity that individuals have to be critical. So.
Thank you. And I'm going to call on Taifa, but quickly, there's a comment here from Linda Mann. Hi, Linda. Saying, sadly, I believe anti-CRT is an extension of the historical act of silence histories and archives, so not a new act. I think that's, people are saying there is continuity there, although it may have a new manifestation at the moment. But just like the transition of enslavement to convict leasing, this is another form of racial oppression and a continued denial of truth and memory, or to truth and memory. So, Taifa, I don't know if you want to incorporate that in what you were going to say, but over to you.
I think Carlos had a comment before I raised my hand. So, Carlos, if you wanted to go ahead.
I don't see that. I didn't see the hand. I'm sorry, Carlos.
Yeah, I didn't raise my virtual hand. I just
okay.
But I'll just make this quick, because I know we want to get to a lot. But you asked about sort of the psychological consequences. I really want to focus on the institutional ones, because I think that's what's going to be the most devastating over time. And I think what's at core is when we remove histories of slavery, when we remove histories of racial violence, it inhibits students to really care about those histories, and by extension of those histories, those communities affected. And so by removing the history, you're removing the ability to actually develop a level of compassion, care, and understanding, not just for the history, but for those communities, right? And so what's really at stake is when people don't know who they are, like what their country's history is, they don't know who they are, they can't change who they are, right? You can't change something that you don't know, right? And so when we don't know that we have this history of racial violence, we can't change how it's showing up in the present, right? When we don't know, and the key is when we don't know and we don't even know to care. And that's the most devastating consequence, right, of these book bans, right? And I think there are psychological ramifications for all that when we talk about the resentment that we have in terms of having discussion, right? And the ways in which it can, by delegitimizing histories, it delegitimizes people's current day identities, right? All that is happening in the classroom. But I think the real institutional devastating impact, right, is the ways in which it erodes a kind of care, concern in the present for how those histories show up, right? And that's what we got to really fight against.
Thank you for that. And Taifa, it looks like you've put a resource in the chat for some more kind of research on Carlos's point. So let's go to Taifa, and then there's still a little room if anybody wants to raise anything from the attendees. But otherwise, we'll start to wrap up after that, and maybe just do a quick round for a minute each of everybody if you want to say something or not. after that. So Taif, over to you.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to share is that about 10 years ago, I was a first-year law student in a constitutional law class at Georgetown. And my professor asked, well, what was the reason for the Civil War? And the response was about an 80-20 split, right? Where 80% of us were like, well, it was certainly about enslavement. And the other 20% was like, well, it was certainly about states' rights. And I'm like, states' rights to do what? You know, like, let's be honest. And I think that, Lisa, there was a little bit of sadness in your question that I wanted to lift up in saying that that there are certainly psychological impacts that are, you know, that students from historically subordinated groups are experiencing. One thing that gives me hope, though, is Gen Z. I feel like they're going to save us. I feel like they're going to save us all. Glenn Youngkin, the Virginia governor, issued a CRT tip line. And the purpose of this tip line was to call in or to send an email and to report any instances of critical race theory being taught. So what did Gen Z do? They took to TikTok and overwhelmed this tip line so that it had to be disconnected. And so stories like that are hopeful to me. In addition, there are students in Temecula in California who are protesting and demanding that these book bans be reversed, that they learn about this information. I'm the fun aunt, so I get an insight into my teenage nieces and nephews that my sisters do not get, and they're learning this information, right? They're finding ways in which to read the books that are banned, in which to learn about the curriculum that they want to, and finding the teachers they feel are supportive of teaching this while also protecting themselves. And so these instances are the things that give me hope. Kids are resilient, and I'm not putting it all on their shoulders to fix this solution. But I really do believe that this generation of students are living up to the call to ensure that they get the tools necessary to, as I mentioned before, address some of the most pressing racial and social justice issues of our time. But then again, it takes them doing the work, and it also takes us doing the work. Nadine being able to work across partisan lines to introduce resolutions. It takes Carlos being able to facilitate the education of students in the classroom. It takes Clara to understand how these things are impacting us, not just in the United States, but across the world, and where there are connections and where we might be able to say, we're not going to repeat history. And what we're going to do is we're going to set ourselves up in a way to really fulfill our lived potential as a multiracial democracy. And then the last thing I'll just say is that I'm a scholar of critical race theory, taught by some of the best to ever do it, Cheryl Harris, Devin Carbato, Kimberly Crenshaw. And one of the things that I do know is that this country from the beginning was founded on this understanding that it was okay to dispossess land from indigenous communities, that it was okay to count certain people as 3/5 in order to be able to get electoral power, and that it was also okay to limit the type of people who can come into this country. And so this isn't new. I just want to reiterate what Linda mentioned. But this is an evolution in a way that is using the law or the master's tools in order to come about a solution or to allow for the proliferation of these things to occur. And it's going to take a lot of creativity on our part in order to resist in new and different and effective ways.
Thank you for that. There is a comment or a question that's emerged here from comment really from Lisel Gutierrez about the sort of fear of speaking up and having safe spaces in institutions without feeling the fear of retaliation. I see part of that as being along the lines of what Carlos was getting at in terms of when you don't know the stories, when the stories are not part of the narrative, when there's a history of so much exclusion, then suddenly, you're not suddenly, but gradually you are increasingly afraid to have those kinds of conversations because of retaliation of some kind. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that. And then there's another comment here, which is prefaced by saying this is not a public question. So never mind. I'll look at that one and see if I can translate it into something. Does anybody want to comment on that? Or why don't we do this? Why don't we go around and everybody, you're welcome to either pass or not. And if you want to say something for a minute or so, and maybe we go in the reverse order we went in the initial time, which would be Clara, Nadine, Carlos, and Taifa. And again, welcome to chip in something, kind of closing thought or not. Clara?
I just want to echo Taifa and in a hopeful note. I also think that young people today have more means, to receive a lot of fake news and like conspiracy theories and things like that. But I also feel we work with lots of schools here in Brazil, but like also in other countries. And there is, for me, a sense that they are going to look for what they want, and that there's these spaces, and that they are challenging things that the older generation did. And we don't know like how crazy this history is. Like you cannot talk about like, of course, progress and all that stuff nowadays. But I do feel that that there's more spaces and there's a lot of initiatives going on that are actually increasing or shared moral capacity to look into the world in a cumulative manner, so to say. So I also want to end in that thing, like, this is very important work. It needs to be done, and we need to keep doing it because there's hope, and that's what remains ahead. Otherwise,
thank you.
Thank you very much also for having me in this panel. It's really a pleasure also to learn more about what's going on in the United States around these issues.
Nadine?
So I also would like to end on a hopeful note. And one of the things is that we've seen this, as the point's been made quite well. This is not new. We've seen it over and over with various means, but ultimately each time these forces are ultimately defeated. And so as someone working for a literary organization, I just want to highlight the beauty of literature and the access to information, and how it does allow us to celebrate, to identify, to empathize, and I mentioned earlier to envision, and as you said, Louis, to imagine. So I think with all of us continuing on this path, and there are more of us working in this vein than there are working against it, we can get there. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, great, thanks. Carlos?
Yeah, I would also like to resituate the conversation. We focus really on the kind of attacks against education, against critical race theory, against just understanding these histories authentically. And I think that's important because we have to understand it. But I always tell my students that it's, in terms of thinking about the African-American experience, it's not about what happened to Black people, but what we did in response to what happened to us. And in saying, and framing my comment this way, what we've seen, I think, most impressively in Oklahoma is a grassroots response to HB 1775, particularly in Tulsa. I can say that there's a grassroots effort, Black History Saturdays, that's developed, not in direct response to HB 1775, but now since HB 1775 has become a reality, the work that it's doing is even more important. And so what Black History Saturdays is all about is getting community, and particularly families, intergenerational groups, learning about the history together, and being able to then utilize that history to do community work, to do community action. And so in so many ways, HB 1775 has empowered communities to know their histories better and do more with it. And so that's been really a blessing to see, and that so that HB 1775 is not quelling or in many, at least in Tulsa, what I'm seeing in the community is not disempowering people around the history. So I've been really happy to see that.
Excellent, thanks. And Taifa.
I think the one parting note that I have is that this movement in the summer of 2020 was one that was had extreme transformational value. And just going back a little bit to Lisa's question, it was met with immediate backlash, and that's the world in which we are living now. And while that's the world we're living in, like my colleagues have already mentioned, it's not the one that has to be the future. And so what that means, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us to be able to resist in the communities that we are in order to ensure that we live in a future, not just for us, but for our children, so that they can thrive and be the best that they can be. And unfortunately, they cannot do that without access to truth. And so I encourage every one of you on this call to figure out how you might be able to support the work that we are all doing, or work in your community that is engaged in resisting and ensuring that we all have the right to truth.
That's a great note to end on. Lisa, I don't know if there's any last minute things from your side, or can we close it out?
We can just stay tuned. In the spring, we'll have a panel on the role of media in national movements. So if you're interested in learning more, I put my email to join the TJ in the USA listserv if you want to stay posted on that. And thank you everyone for your amazing contributions.
Yeah, same here. Thanks everyone. Thanks Lisa for convening everybody. So thank you all. And with that, I guess we will close it down. Do I do something? Do I press a button? Thanks everyone.
Thank you everyone. Have a
Okay.
good rest of your day.